All right, today we're going to break down a really provocative theory about where executive power actually lies. We're going to follow the logic of one particular source, step by step, and just lay out its argument and the evidence it presents. Let's dive right in.
You know, the entire argument we're examining today really boils down to this one idea, that the permanent bureaucracy, the so-called deep state, isn't actually looking for leaders. It's looking for managers. And according to this source, that is the exact framework we should use to understand the political career of Joe Biden.
So, let's start at the beginning with the first part of this case study, what the text calls the selection of the vessel. The source doesn't frame this as a normal political story. Instead, it describes it as a kind of systematic process for finding and grooming a compliant executive.
So according to this analysis, when the permanent state is sizing up a potential president, the most important qualities aren't their strengths, but actually their vulnerabilities. The argument is that they're on the lookout for someone with enough ambition to want the job, but who also has some pretty significant ethical or even biological weak spots. Why? Because that makes them easy to manage and, if it ever came down to it, easy to bypass completely.
Okay, this brings us to a really critical moment back in 1987. It's an event the source describes as an ethical stress test. And in their view, this was the exact moment the chosen asset first proved he was in fact compliant.
Now, what's absolutely crucial to the source's argument is the timeline you're looking at right here. You see how these two key events happen one right after the other? An ethical collapse in late 1987, and then boom, just a few months later, a massive biological event in early '88. The text argues these two moments are totally connected.
Let's just quickly run through the details of that 1987 campaign meltdown. Biden was caught lifting the life story of a British politician, Neil Kinnock, almost word for word. Then it came out that he'd also plagiarized speeches from RFK and Hubert Humphrey. And the whole thing snowballed until he had to admit he'd even plagiarized a big chunk of a law review article back when he was at Syracuse.
Now, here is where the source's argument takes a really sharp turn. To the public, this was obviously a humiliating political failure. But to what the text calls the intelligence apparatus, this was actually a successful test. The claim is that it showed a psychological profile that was just perfect for their needs, someone willing to read from a script and deliver words written by someone else as if they were his own.
And that brings us to the second pillar of this argument, the biological compromise. So if the ethical test proves psychological compliance, this next phase supposedly locked in a physical dependency on the system itself.
So just months after his campaign flamed out, Biden had a physical collapse. He was diagnosed with a ruptured brain aneurysm, a truly catastrophic hemorrhage, and was airlifted to Walter Reed. The surgeons there had to perform two separate, incredibly invasive brain surgeries to clamp the aneurysms. And the source really hammers this point home. There is an immense risk of permanent cognitive damage from these procedures, especially to the frontal lobe, which is what controls our executive function.
This is so central to the argument. From this point of view, a massive neurological vulnerability like this, well, it wasn't a problem, it was the ultimate feature. The claim is that by installing an executive with this kind of serious medical history, the permanent bureaucracy could basically guarantee its own power and control.
All right, let's fast forward to the present day. The source's next section gets into what it calls the failing hardware. The argument here is that by 2024, the biological reality of the situation just became too obvious to ignore, forcing the system to take even more drastic, visible measures. The source points to several really specific examples of what it terms observable anomalies. It talks about a stiff, wide-based walk, those very public moments of freezing up at events like the G7 summit, and instances of seeming, disconnected from his surroundings. And the absolute peak of all this, according to the text, was his cognitive performance during that first presidential debate of 2024.
And this all builds to the final section of the source's argument, which is where we get the title of this explainer, the Autopen Presidency. This is the theory for how the bureaucracy allegedly just bypasses the executive altogether.
So, what in the world is an Autopen Presidency? Well, the source defines it as a system where the president is mostly kept out of the public eye, while a small committee of unelected officials actually runs policy. And in this model, the most important documents aren't even signed by the person, but by an autopen, a machine that perfectly replicates a signature.
And who does the source claim was in this shadow cabinet? Well, it names these key unelected figures as the main operators. It points to the chiefs of staff, Ron Klain and Jeff Zients, along with Secretary of State Anthony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, as the group it alleges was really calling the shots. And this brings us to the source's final verdict.
The 2020-2024 administration was, in its view, the perfection of this whole model. The argument is simple. An individual was put in place who was compromised both ethically and biologically. And when his cognition seemed to fail, the system just propped him up, shielded him from the public, and used a machine to sign the paperwork. This, allegedly, proved that all they ever really needed was a vessel.
And so, we end right where the source material leaves us, with a really fundamental question about power. If you follow this text's claims all the way to their logical conclusion, and the elected executive is just a figurehead, a vessel for a mechanical pen, it really forces the question, who is actually writing the orders?